Good afternoon and welcome to the CLEAR webinar series. I'm Dave Dixon, coming to you from the Middlesex County Extension Center here in Haddam, Connecticut. And with me today is Dr. Jamie Vaudrey from our Department of Marine Sciences here at UConn. And Dr. Vaudrey is going to talk to us today about nitrogen pollution in Long Island Sound, particularly focused on the embayments, a study she's been working on for several years that helps to identify where the sources of that pollution are coming from. Finally, for those of you who are new to our center, Center for Land Use Education and Research, we've been a center here at UConn since 2002, so celebrating our 15th anniversary this year. We are a collaboration of the Department of Extension, the Department of Natural Resources and Environment, both within the College of Ag, as well as the Connecticut Sea Grant Program. There's about 8 or 9 of us here, depending on how you count, working on various programs, and primarily are grant funded that support our positions. And our basic mission is basically to support communities in making land use decisions, to support better land use decisions, healthier natural resources, and more resilient communities. And so enough opening remarks. I'm going to now turn it over to Dr. Vaudrey, who I thank for joining us today and talking to us about her study. So take it away, Jamie.
All right, thank you, Dave. So this model, it builds well on CLEAR's mission in that it lets us look at land use practices in the watershed of embayments and estimate how much the land use practices will impact the water quality in the embayments. If you look at the 2 pictures that are on the screen now, we see a very forested, naturally vegetated watershed in Connecticut, versus on the right, a heavily modified environment. So the one on the left is from Southington, the one on the right is the East River down in New York City. These 2 landscapes and the way that we use this land influences the amount of nitrogen and other nutrients that are being put into our waterways and how that translates into water quality down in the embayments. So we're going to start off with our first poll. And the question is, how many embayments are along the coast of Long Island? So 110 was the winner, with about 40% saying yes to 110, 143 coming in a close second, and then a few respondents at 75 or 45. And if we look at the numbers of embayments along the coast of Long Island Sound, it is indeed 110. And I'll show you a map of that in just a moment. I wanted to give credit to the funding sources and to the many people who worked on this project. So this came out of a project, 2 projects actually, funded by the Long Island Sound Study, Connecticut Sea Grant, and New York Sea Grant, with the first project in 2011 and the second project starting in 2013. And I had a number of PIs on the project, and then many people who were involved with collecting the data, as well as some additional sources of funding as we went along. So I mentioned 110 embayments, and these are those 110 embayments. We looked at nutrient load in each of these colored watersheds, and if you count up the colored watersheds here, there are actually 116 showing, and that's because places like the Saugatuck River were divided into the freshwater portion of the river and the saltwater portion of the river. And there are some other embayments where we were interested in looking at more upriver, downriver sites. But if we look at the number of embayments we assessed, there are 110 of them. So you might be wondering what an embayment is. An embayment is a recess in the shoreline, and we defined it as it has a freshwater input coming into that. That freshwater input can be as large as the Housatonic River or as small as a tiny stream. These places have names like harbor, bay, cove, river. They also have names like gut, pond, inlet. So they're basically all of these little bays and harbors lining the coast of Long Island Sound. The goal of our project was to look at the land use practices in these watersheds and determine the nitrogen load to these small embayments. So we weren't looking at the load to Long Island Sound. And if you look around this map here, you'll notice that there are areas, especially out on Long Island, that don't have any colored watersheds. Doesn't mean there's no nitrogen loading coming from there. It just means that that load is going directly to Long Island Sound. We were interested in the smaller coves, rivers, bays that we knew relatively little about in comparison to the extensive monitoring that has been done in Long Island Sound. As part of this, we also did field work at each of the yellow points that are shown on this map. And I'm going to start off by showing you a few of the results of that field work. So to cover, one thing that I wanted to get into that our model does not cover is we did not take into account the larger watersheds of our major rivers. So the Connecticut River, the Thames River, and the Housatonic River. We did look at the coastal portion of those rivers, but we didn't extend up into the whole watersheds for those systems. So if we take a look at just that coastal portion, and I always like to give the end away here, so I'm showing you what our final conclusions are, and then we'll work back to how we get to this point. When we look at just the area shown in the map up in the right, the embayments constitute about 18% of the load to our coastal waters, to those estuarine waters of Long Island Sound. Looking at just the coastal portions of the Thames River, Connecticut, and Housatonic River, you can see that they're all relatively low, less than 2% of the total load. And the East River, with its very high population and a lot of sewer outfall into that Western Sound, that coastal portion of the East River contributes about 78% of the load. But remember, that's just the coastal portion of Long Island Sound. We also have those larger watersheds for the Thames River, Connecticut River, and Housatonic River. And when we look at the whole watersheds, using estimates from the USGS Sparrow model, we can see that the Connecticut River and the East River contribute roughly equal amounts of nitrogen to Long Island Sound. What this model doesn't capture is the impact of flow in the estuary, either in the embayments, those tiny rivers and bays, or in Long Island Sound in general. So while the Connecticut River and the East River contribute roughly equal amounts of nitrogen to the Sound, the impact from the East River is much greater because it's emptying into that western end of the Sound where we don't get a lot of flushing. Whereas the Connecticut River certainly contributes some nitrogen loads to Long Island Sound, but it's also closer to that Atlantic Ocean flushing. And so some of that nitrogen is taken out to the Atlantic Ocean and doesn't impact the Sound nearly as much as the East River inputs do. So in this view, we see that embayments constitute about 10% of the load when we're looking at the overall load to Long Island Sound. But again, we knew relatively little about the status of these embayments in terms of how they were doing for water quality and the load, where that load was coming from and how we might be able to change people's behaviors to get that load reduced. So as I mentioned, I'm going to start off with just a little bit of the field work that we did in those 15 sites, those 15 embayments. We went out and did rapid assessments, which means that we were sampling these systems within about a 3-week period. We hit all of the systems and we started sampling at dawn. We tried to get there when it was dark, and we'll see why dark was important in just a moment. And we quickly sampled many parameters in all of these systems so that we could compare among the systems using the same metrics, the same data. I'm not going to go into all of our fieldwork because I want to get to the nitrogen loads, but this was one of the interesting findings. This is the dissolved oxygen from a bottom sensor placed in Niantic River and Milford Harbor, both along the Connecticut coastline. And over on the right, you see the Connecticut deep definitions of hypoxia and anoxia, the interim management goal, and then the levels that are protective of marine life. And what we see is that these bays are going super saturated during the day. So that oxygen level is getting very, very high. And then at night, it's dropping down into the hypoxic region, or in some cases, the anoxic region. So meaning that we have no oxygen left in the water. And I call this or I describe this as the bays are panting. So we want our bays to have a normal breath in and breath out over that daily 24-hour cycle. But what we're seeing is very high oxygen beyond what is normal, going down to very low oxygen at night. So this is a stressful situation for marine life and the benthos and all of the organisms in these systems. And some people ask, well, isn't this normal? Wouldn't we find this if we go to any embayment? While that up and down cycle of oxygen over 24 hours is normal, the level that we're seeing in embayments is not a natural cycle. It is definitely a result of human influences. This graphic is showing you system size along the x-axis, so we're going from the very small tributaries to very large systems. And then on the y-axis, we have the duration of hypoxia. And I put a little arrow there showing where the embayments fall. So it is typical for embayments to go up and down in oxygen over that 24-hour cycle, but that up and down cycle is heavily influenced by the activities that humans are doing in the watershed and the impact that it has on local systems. In contrast, Long Island Sound, a little bigger system, again, some of that will be natural here, but a lot of it is because of the human influences, our large population and the nutrients that we're pouring into our coastal waters. So what impact does this have in these embayments? We often hear about the low oxygen in Long Island Sound and how it goes very low in the summer, and that impacts fish life and other aquatic life. In the embayments, we're talking about very shallow water. They're often 3 to 6 feet deep on average, and light is reaching the bottom in these systems. And when you have this combination of high nutrients and a lot of light, you get the growth of seaweed. What you're showing here is Charlie Yarish, one of my colleagues on the project from UConn, and he's reached into the water with just a regular garden rake, pulls it maybe 2 or 3 feet along the bottom, and this is the amount of algae that's coming up. Now, algae is not easy to catch with a rake, so if you're able to pull up this amount with just a short reach out with a rake, it means that there is an immense amount of algae on the bottoms of these systems. And that's an indication of nutrient over-enrichment or nutrient pollution. There's just too much nutrients coming in and fertilizing these seaweeds in the system. Now, this is an example from Little Narragansett Bay, which is on the border of Rhode Island and Connecticut. And it has a small cove that feeds into it, Wickety-Quack Cove, and then a much larger river, the Pawcatuck River, that feeds into it. And the Pawcatuck River has 3 point sources of nutrients, 2 wastewater treatment facilities, and then a manufacturing plant that is putting nutrients into the water. The colors on this image are indicating the biomass or the amount of seaweed in the system. Where you see those red and purplish areas, you're looking at algae that is 1 foot to 3 feet thick on the bottom. And in the background of this image is the picture of the Cladophora, the algae from this particular bay. You can see as you come down the Pawcatuck River, once you get to this salty area and the algae can grow, you get this clear signal of nutrients coming out of the Pawcatuck River and kind of getting stuck in this bay and fueling the growth of this algae. This system once hosted seagrass or eelgrass, which is a beneficial plant, something that we like to see and that's a good indicator of water quality. In the early 90s, seagrass was found throughout this bay, and in the late 90s, by the late 90s, it was gone. And we believe it's a combination of temperature and this increasing nutrient inputs to the system. So if we take a broader look at all of these systems that we assessed, we used an approach to quantify how heavily they're being impacted by nutrient loading. And you can see that Long Island Sound, most of our systems are in the red and the orange, which are not good. It means that there's a high impact from nutrient loading combined with other factors that are making the water quality in these systems not great. We do have a few in the yellow and the green over in the Eastern Sound. So this was one of the surprising things, because we often think of the Eastern Sound as being a relatively good environment. We see seagrass there, good water quality. You can scallop and go oystering in that area. But on the national scale, our embayments, because of our heavy population, are being impacted more so than embayments around the country. So let's get into that impact and that land use that I've been mentioning. The main goal of this project was to look at land use in the watersheds of these embayments and see or estimate the amount of nitrogen being delivered from those different sources. This is a loading model, meaning that it tells us about what is being put on the land right now. It doesn't tell us how long it'll take that nitrogen to reach the estuary. We need a different type of model for that. The Long Island community, as part of the Long Island Nitrogen Action Plan, is conducting just this type of transport model, or this model that tells you about the time it takes for nitrogen to travel. But this is not what this model does. This model also doesn't tell us about the ecology or the biology, the chemistry that's happening in the estuary itself. Again, that takes a different type of model. The Long Island Sound study is currently sponsoring a project where a consulting company is estimating that ecological impact in embayments using this nitrogen load data, and then seeing what they think will happen when it hits the water. So again, this model tells us about the load, the amount of nitrogen that we're putting into the watershed right now. And because of that, it's a good model for talking about how our actions are impacting nitrogen loading and how we can change our actions to reduce that nutrient loading. This little schematic gives you an idea of where things are coming from. Over on the right-hand side, we have more of our homes, our parks, our golf courses. From those areas, we have fertilizer going in. People have septic systems. We have roofs and lawns that atmospheric deposition or rain and dust settle onto, and that rain and dust carry nitrogen. We also have natural vegetation, our forests, our fields, and wetlands. Those systems work to remove nitrogen and improve our water quality. So changing from a forested area to a golf course will have an impact on the nitrogen load. It will increase that nitrogen load to the embayment. We also, moving over to the left, we get more of our dense sources. So in our cities, we have not just the runoff going into our storm drains, which often lead directly to our waterways, but we also have the sewer outputs into embayments and into Long Island Sound. Our sewer plants do a good job at making that outfall safe. In other words, there's no bacteria, there's no solids, but we aren't so good at removing nitrogen from that sewer outfall water. And then the last category is that fertilizer applied to agricultural systems. And while we don't have a lot of agriculture in our embayment watersheds, we do have a few where that is important. So second poll, which source category of loading contributes the most to embayments of Long Island Sound? Is it going to be that atmospheric deposition, the rain and the dust falling on the watersheds, the fertilizer, human waste from septic systems, or human waste from our sewer systems? So we had 42% of people saying fertilizer, and 23% septic systems, 33% sewer systems, so we'll say 50% from human waste. And if we look at the contribution, which I will get to in a moment, oh, that's okay. So we'll get to the figure that relates to those contributions in just a moment. Once we get those loads, the atmospheric deposition, the fertilizer, the wastewater, the water carrying those nutrients travels through the groundwater of the watershed, through the streams and the ponds of the watershed. And in the case of wastewater treatment facilities, it's usually traveling through a pipe and exiting directly into the estuary. In each of these zones, so we have 3 zones. We have the soil zone, the vadose zone, which is our unsaturated zone, so it's not water saturated, and then the aquifer, which is the saturated zone. And for each of these categories, we can estimate how much nitrogen is removed given the source, the type of land that it came onto, and then something about the geology of the system. When we look at the nitrogen load, we're not just looking at that land use and the geology of the system, we're also looking at where it's being contributed within the watershed. So on the left-hand panel, we have a 200-meter buffer around an embayment. This 200-meter buffer, any activity in that zone will have a greater impact. There's less time for nitrogen to be removed before it travels to the embayment. In the near area, this is areas of the watershed that are outside of that 200-meter buffer, but are draining directly to the embayment via groundwater or into streams and down into the system. In the far area, those are areas of the watershed which drain first to a lake or a pond or a wetland. And those areas remove additional nitrogen. So if you're draining to a freshwater area, you're going to get some additional attenuation or removal of nitrogen. Okay, so getting to our poles. When we add up the source contributions throughout our embayments of Long Island Sound, so this does not include those big rivers, the Thames River, Connecticut, Housatonic, or the East River, we see that 37% of the load going to embayments is coming from sewer, with about 30% from septic. Only 23% is estimated to come from fertilizer, and about 10% from that atmospheric deposition, the rain and the dust. So our results from the poll indicated that about 42% was coming from fertilizer, and a total of about 50% from human waste, septic and sewer together. So we see that the contribution from septic and sewer is often larger than people think about. Now, I mentioned that we model different zones within the watershed. Those different zones have an impact, especially on the septic nitrogen. That's where it is most important in the model to have these zones. So in that zone that is furthest away from the embayment, in this case, let's start down with the embayment. The embayment is the little blue area down at the bottom of the map. This is Mamaroneck River in New York. And the green arrow is pointing to that 200-meter buffer. The middle area is the area that drains directly to the embayment without going to a pond first. And then the blue arrow is pointing to that further area that's going to drain to a pond or wetland before continuing on to the embayment, so it gets some additional removal of nitrogen. And we can see that if you have one person on a septic system in that 200-meter buffer, you're going to have more than twice as much nitrogen reaching the embayment as if it's someone in that area that's further out. We have a question, and Dave's just pulling it up. So how do waste treatment plants factor into that last pie chart?
I think that was earlier in the
gotcha.
talk. So if you want to save that for the end.
I will go back because I actually think it was, if you can get that back to here.
Back to here.
Yeah. There we go. That sewer treatment from this pie chart here, that is reported loads from the wastewater treatment facilities. So to get that sewer input, we looked at averages, the average input over the last 4 years to get an estimate of the sewer input of nitrogen. So that's reported loads from the treatment facilities. If a treatment plant was upgraded to nitrogen removal within that 4-year time period, then we only looked at the information from after it was upgraded. So we didn't include that pre-upgrade estimates. Okay, so moving on to how we get at septic systems. We have in Long Island Sound, in our watershed, we have people on septic, we have people on cesspools, mostly out on Long Island. And on Long Island, we also have vertical septic systems, which are kind of a mix between a septic and a cesspool. So the drain field goes down into the ground instead of out, as it does in a traditional septic system. And then we have people on sewer. So we look at the distance from the estuary. Is it within that 200-meter buffer, or is it further out? And then we look at attenuation factors or removal factors of nitrogen. So looking at the septic system, since that's most of our Connecticut systems, there's about 60% of the nitrogen makes it out of the septic tanks and the leaching fields. Of that amount, about 66% makes it out of the plume that is associated with the septic system. And then 100 to 85% of the nitrogen entering there makes it through the aquifer, which is that saturated zone in the groundwater. If we do the math here, at the bottom, it tells you the amount that gets to the estuary. So for every unit of nitrogen put in from a septic system, about 34 to 39% of that nitrogen is going to make it down to the embayment. Now, in reality, it gets more complicated. That's an oversimplification, because as part of this, we also look at the geology of the watersheds. You know, what type of soil do you have in this area? How close is bedrock to the surface of the soil? And how might that impact the removal of nitrogen? So for different zones, we've calculated the estimated nitrogen removal. And you can see that in the Connecticut area, we're getting higher nitrogen removals, usually 20 to 40% of nitrogen is removed as it travels down to the embayment. Whereas when we get down to the Long Island areas, so Huntington Bay, Complex, Nissequag River, and down the list to Goldsmith Inlet, that's a much sandier area, and we see much lower removal. 4 to 11% of the nitrogen is removed, so a lot more is making it down to the embayment. So while I'm giving you a taste of the things that go into the model, we could always sit down and get into the complex details of much of this. So moving on to atmospheric deposition. Atmospheric deposition is the rain and snow that fall onto the landscape. That's our wet deposition, as well as the dry deposition. So the dust and the particles that settle onto the landscape and onto the embayment itself. In order to calculate this, we need to know how much it rains. So we looked at rainfall in our area around the time that this model was created. And then we estimate from that rainfall how much dry deposition, how much dust and particles are settling onto the landscape. And again, this gets complicated. So as we deliver that nitrogen to the landscape that it falls on impacts how much nitrogen is removed. So we look at natural upland vegetation and wetland vegetation. We look at developed areas, which usually have homes with roofs and driveways and manicured lawns. We also look at high density areas. So these are our cities, shopping malls, our highly developed areas, and then agricultural land. And for each of these, we calculate, again, how much is removed as the nitrogen travels through the different layers of the ground. What we get is the total percent of N reaching the embayment. So if we look at natural upland vegetation, about 14% of the rain and dust falling onto a forest will make it, if it's close to the estuary, will make it down to the embayment. Whereas if we go into the inland portions of the watershed, we see that only about 6% of the nitrogen that falls onto those forests makes it down to the embayment. So again, it matters where that rain is falling, both in terms of how the land has been developed and also its location within the watershed. We have a few questions coming in that we're going to look at real quick. So there was a question, how did you determine that the buffer should be 200 feet? It's actually 200 meters. And this was based on the average length of the plume coming out of septic systems. And this was developed from data collected around the country, and it's been applied in many estuaries. So that was the big determinant for the 200-meter buffer area. And then, are there any assumptions as to the age of septics or maintenance of septics? And I can't see the rest of the question, but the assumptions that we use are that the septic systems are operating optimally. So they are traditional septic systems. They're not nitrogen removing, the advanced septic systems that do nitrogen removal. But the assumption is also that they are maintained correctly and that their drain field is operating correctly. So you don't have a broken drain field where you're having raw sewage come to the surface of your yard, for instance. So those are the biggest assumptions. Okay, moving on to fertilizer. We're going to just look at the ground portion of fertilizer first. With fertilizer application, once it gets onto the ground, we assume that 61% is not lost as gas. So it's not volatilized or lost to the atmosphere. Of that 61% that makes it to the vadose, 39% of that makes it through the vadose, and then 85% makes it down to the aquifer. If we do the math for those, about 20% of the fertilizer that you put on is going to make it down to the embayment. Now remember again that this is going to change based on where you are in the watershed, but that's kind of the average value. So people often ask, where do we get the fertilizer data from? And fertilizer data are hard to get because you need to find out what people are doing at their homes, which is not an easy thing to make assumptions about. We based a lot of this work on data from the Public Perception Survey of Long Island Sound watershed residents that came out in 2006, and then also spoke with turf scientists at UConn to confirm and enrich our estimates of fertilizer use, both on lawns and in parks and recreational areas. So for this survey, they broke up the Long Island Sound watershed into 4 sections. Connecticut was lumped together, Bronx and Queens, Westchester County, and then Long Island. About 1,220 people were interviewed, and I'm not going to go through all of these numbers here. They did come directly from the survey. The link is provided, and you can always return to these sections in the recorded copy of this webinar. But what we did is we looked at not just who was fertilizing, but how many times do you fertilize a year? Several times, once per year, less than once per year, never fertilize, don't know. And we make assumptions about what people are putting down as far as the load, because we know that they fertilize once a year, but we have to assume that they're following the directions on the bag as far as the amount of fertilizer that is being put down. So we go through a calculation, and from this we can come up with the application rate within these 4 areas of the Long Island Sound watershed. And that's what's shown over here on the left, which is our residential fertilization. And you can see that from that survey data, we're able to come up with an average value for those 4 different zones of the Long Island Sound watershed, but we also have a range of values. And I haven't mentioned this up to this point yet, But for all of these attenuation factors, so the nitrogen removal factors and the loading rates, we have an average value and we have a range of values. This allows us to run the model 10,000 times, allowing those many variables to vary within their range, and we can get our best guess at the nitrogen load plus some error bars on how well we think we know that load based on the data that we have. So the other categories for fertilizer application are golf courses. Notoriously hard to get fertilizer information from golf courses. They don't want to tell us the rate at which they fertilize. So we use a standard rate that comes out of the few studies that have been done on golf courses. We also have parks and recreational fields and values of the average that those are fertilized along with ranges, and that comes from UConn Soil Science Department, who do a lot of work with municipalities and lawn maintenance companies in the Connecticut region. And then agricultural areas, we looked at the EPA's document on fertilizer applied to agriculture for this time period. Now, when we put all of those things together, so we put all those loads together and the removal factors, the distance from the estuary, we're able to come up with a total load to the embayment. And this does include that sewer contribution. I should mention that for places like the East River, which obviously dominates the load when we're comparing these coastal areas of Long Island Sound, we didn't include the sewer treatment facilities that discharge directly to Long Island Sound. These are only the sewer facilities that discharge to the East River or are discharging into an embayment. So there are more sewer facilities out in Long Island Sound, sewer outfalls in Long Island Sound. So what we see is East River dominant when we're looking at the total load. But we do see a number of sites that are, getting off the origin there. We can see their bars showing up, and I've put the names of some of those systems here. The order that we're looking at is over on the left at Site 0, we're starting at the Rhode Island border at Pawcatuck River, Rhode Island, Connecticut border. We move west along Connecticut, so you can see the Thames River. West of that is the Connecticut River, getting over to New Haven Harbor. And eventually we come down to New York City with the East River. From the East River, we then move east along Long Island. So this is going out along Long Island to the very tip of Long Island. This is a little hard to look at. If we zoom in, so now the East River is up past your ceiling, we can see that there are differences in the loading, in the total load to these systems, and I'll be explaining the color of these bars in just a second. Now, while total load is helpful, it is not always informative as to what we might expect for water quality in our embayments. So total load is important when we're looking at Long Island Sound overall. But the size of the embayment that load goes into matters. So if we look at a load of 12 units going into a large embayment, we might get 0.5 units of nitrogen per area of the embayment. We can go to a smaller load. If we have a smaller load of 3 units of nitrogen, shown in the red arrow, going into a smaller embayment, we can get that same loading rate of 0.5 nitrogen units per embayment. But if we take that same load of 3 units of nitrogen and put it into a larger embayment, you can see that now we're at a lower nitrogen load, a load of 0.3 units per embayment. So this means that if we have a similar load going into a large embayment, that nitrogen is being diluted over a larger area. This makes looking at the total load not especially relevant when we're interested in the embayment water quality. Instead, what we want to do is take the load, that total load, and divide it by the area of the embayment that's receiving that load. And when we do that, we get a different picture. what we're looking at here are those same sites we were looking at before. This is the error bars that you're looking at are the error of those 10,000 model runs, allowing all of our variables to vary within their range. So you can get an idea of how well we think we know the average value and the range of that value. And what we see is that some of the systems are the same as on that previous slide. So now we're looking at the load divided by the area of the estuary. The sites in blue also showed up as our top 20 sites for highest loads. So Pawcatuck River, Nissequag River, Paquonic River, Black Rock Harbor, East River. They're showing up on this figure as well. But now we're seeing embayments that we don't necessarily recognize. Some of these were new names to me. Fence Creek, Tom's Creek, Frost Creek were not embayments that I was familiar with. And these are much smaller embayments that have a relatively small load, but when you put that load into these tiny little water bodies, it can have a big impact on the water quality. The other thing that came out of our field work was that the amount of tidal restriction in a system matters. So if a bar is blue here, if a site is blue, it means that there's no tidal restriction. If it's red, it means that there are multiple tidal restrictions. So what do I mean by tidal restrictions? For instance, in Connecticut, where we see most of our orange and red and yellow sites, we have train bridges and Highway 95 that run along our coast. And those bridges often choke off these embayments and slow down the flushing of these embayments. So a load put into an embayment that has a tiny opening will have a much bigger impact than if that embayment is well flushed by the tide. So it's getting fresh water from Long Island Sound twice a day. Now, I'm going to zoom in and show you some of the output that you can get from this model. What I've given you thus far is an overview of what we see in the system, or an overview of the information that we get out of this model. But this model was designed to allow individuals to go in and look at their own site and say, okay, you know, I don't care what's going on in Niantic River and this place called Frost Creek. I want to know about the Darien River where I live. You know, what's going on in that system. So we have an Excel version of the model that has this comparison sheet in it. You have access to all of the data that fed into the model, but for most people, this comparison sheet is where you're going to want to be. And it allows you to choose sites from a pop-down menu, and you get a lot of figures that come up. So I've only shown the top of this screen, but if we were to scroll down, you'll get to see a lot of the figures that I'll be showing in the next few slides. And this model is available for download from my website, and that website, there will be a link to it at the end of the webinar. So poll 3, which land use category contributes the most nitrogen to embayments from fertilizer application? So we're talking about fertilizer here. Where is most of that fertilizer coming from? Our lawns, our golf courses, our parks and recreational fields, or our agricultural land? So we have about 57% of people saying that lawns are the biggest source, and then lower amounts, 25% agriculture, 8 to 10% for parks and recreational, and golf courses together. So keep those in mind. I'll remind you of them again as we get to the figures that show this. So I'm going to focus in on 4 embayments here. They provide a nice range of land use types. The first is the Darien River and Gorham Pond area in Connecticut, Mamaroneck River, which is just across the border in New York, Hempstead Harbor, and then Mattatuck Creek, which is an agricultural watershed out on the east end of Long Island. So if we look at these systems, we have up here on the top, we have the nitrogen load, the total load, and then on the bottom, we've taken that total load and divided it by the area of the estuary. So that's the effective load. That's the one that we really care about. And looking at these sources, one of the questions that we get at is, how do we handle these loads that are coming in. So if we look at the Mamaroneck River, you may notice that the Mamaroneck River, apparently people there have learned how to recycle all of the nitrogen from their waste because they have no nitrogen from human waste going into Mamaroneck River. Now, it's not that that has been left off of the figure. Instead, Mamaroneck River is almost 100% on sewer. And they export that sewer to another embayment. Actually, it goes out to Long Island Sound for Mamaroneck. So they are exporting their sewer outfall out of their embayment. And that's why we don't see any input from sewer or septic into Mamaroneck River. In that case, Mamaroneck River, we see a high load from fertilizer, and we also see this atmospheric deposition. And this atmospheric deposition, how do we get at this atmospheric deposition, especially when it's to the embayment or happening in the embayment? One of my colleagues, Charlie Yarish and John Kim, two colleagues on this project, have been working on bioextraction, so growing seaweed, harvesting the seaweed, and thus removing nitrogen directly from the embayment. So this is one way to capture that nitrogen once it's already reached the embayment. If we're looking at fertilizer, which is a big source from Mamaroneck River, the model allows us to identify the source of the fertilizer in the watershed, both in terms of whether it's coming from lawns, golf courses, recreational fields, and the location within the watershed. So we can use these types of figures to focus in and say, okay, Mamaroneck River, in order to get at your fertilizer problem, you need to focus on the area that the red arrow is pointing to, so that larger portion of the watershed. And you probably want to start with your golf courses and municipal fields, your recreational fields and parks. So those are places that you can approach to talk about fertilizer use reduction and appropriate application of fertilizer. When we look at, so for each of these, we're able to look at them. Darien River, fertilizer to lawns are the big source. Mamaroneck River, it's golf courses and parks. Same for Hempstead Harbor, golf courses and parks are a big source of fertilizer. And for Mattituck Creek, it's that agricultural land and hay fields that are the big source of their fertilizer contribution. Similarly, we can look at where septic is contributing a problem. So for Darien River, Mamaroneck, Mattituck, septic doesn't contribute a huge portion of the load. But for Hempstead Harbor, septic may be an area that we want to focus on. And the pie chart here tells us again that area that is further than 200 meters from the estuary, but draining directly to the estuary, that's where we want to focus. And we're able to target that portion of the watershed as getting the most bang for our buck if we can reduce that septic input. Now, getting at the survey question, I had asked where does, actually, I guess I didn't answer my own question. The survey question was, where do we see the most fertilizer coming from? And the point that I wanted to make is that it varies greatly by watershed. So while we could make generalizations over the Long Island Sound embayment watersheds, it is much more beneficial to look at these watersheds on an individual basis because they do vary greatly. So some of you said 56% of you thought that lawns were the greatest source, and certainly in places like Darien River, that is true, but we see a lot of areas, especially in the Western Sound, where other sources are more important. So these next few slides, I just want you to take a quick glance. We're going to be moving from Rhode Island, and what's shown here is the Pawcatuck River on our left, and we're moving west along the Connecticut border. And you can see in the map above, the yellow area is telling you where we are as far as which watersheds are being shown. So this is the eastern portion of Connecticut. And you can see I've put stars on the four systems that are the four embayments that are most likely to exhibit water quality impacts from these nitrogen loads. And you can see in eastern Connecticut, we have 4 stars. As we move to western Connecticut and that portion of Westchester, we have a lot of more impacts. So we'll expect to see water quality problems in those embayments in the western area of Connecticut. And as we move out along Long Island, we have relatively few, because as we move out along that Long Island area, we have fewer embayments, first of all, but we're also getting into less populated areas as we move to the east end. So just to wrap up, I wanted to remind you again that embayments contribute about 10% of the load to Long Island Sound overall. So if we're looking at the overall load to Long Island Sound itself, 10% is coming from those embayment watersheds. It seems like a relatively small amount, but the question is, why do we care? And the reason that we care is that these embayments are where people experience Long Island Sound. They're not out in the middle of the Sound. They're swimming at their local beaches, fishing off of piers, boating from their local marinas. These are the waters that people care about, and they're the ones that people are familiar with. So helping people to understand the link between their activities of the watershed and the impact on their local water bodies is important to increasing their ability to understand why it matters to increase nitrogen throughout Long Island Sound overall. So this provides us with an educational opportunity, and it provides us with information at going after those non-point sources that we're seeing from these embayments. So I'll wrap up there. This is the link to where you can download the model and some more information, background information, and my contact information is available.
Great. Thanks, Jamie. And so this is a good time for folks to type in more questions that you may have for Jamie. And while we're doing that, and I will also say that this link that we have up on the screen here now, we'll also post that on our website right underneath the recording of the webinar, so that you can click directly to it if you don't want to copy this down. But while you're typing in questions, I do just want to remind folks that the second part of this kind of nitrogen webinar series that we're doing is coming up in a couple weeks. And that's on June 28th. And that's going to be Kelly Strike from the Connecticut DEEP is going to be talking about DEEP's new strategy for addressing nitrogen pollution in the Sound. And we also have another webinar coming up the day before that on MS4 and sort of what you need to do in your first year. The other quick programming note that I'll mention before we get to the questions is that we're collaborating with DEEP on some nitrogen seminars that are focused on nitrogen for coastal communities. And the idea is to talk about these sources of nitrogen, their impacts and strategies, both at the state level and the local level, for reducing those nitrogen inputs into the Sound. And so those seminars are going to be coming up, or sort of split up on different locations along the coast in August, and we will be sending out more information about that as we get closer. But I'm going to get back to the slide with Jamie's link to our study, and here's our first question in. Right there.
Yep. So before I answer the question, I just wanted to mention that UConn Clear is also making an online viewer of the model results. So we're expecting that within the next few months, you'll also be able to go online and click and explore the output from this model versus using the Excel file. So the question showing up right now is, was the contribution of nitrogen from wildlife considered? Wildlife are not counted in the model because the assumption is that our wildlife are eating in the watershed and excreting in the watershed. And so they speed up the cycling of nitrogen, but the assumption is that the nitrogen has not changed significantly by their activities in the watershed. Now, I mentioned that it does speed up the cycling of nitrogen through the watershed, but remember that this model does not include that time component. It would be great to develop it so that it was a combination of time and loading. But at this point, it doesn't include that. Now, one of the controversial inclusions or exclusions from the model is dog and cat waste, because dogs and cats are fed dog and cat food, which we typically buy, and that's shipped from elsewhere. You know, it's made elsewhere outside of our watersheds and shipped in. And the question is, how much of their waste products end up going into the groundwater versus being bagged and going to a dump? Okay, the next question is, can you expand that a little bit? Yeah. I think you further. Can't do that. Yeah. What about click on it?
There you go.
Okay. Can you briefly explain the baseline scenario for the model? What were the basic characteristics? I'm not sure I understand the question. The baseline scenario is that nitrogen is traveling through the groundwater down to the embayments. It's being loaded at some rate, and it's being transported through that groundwater where attenuation occurs at some rate. And we can relate that removal to what we know of the geology of the area. If you want to type in further, if there's some clarification on that question, if I didn't quite get it.
Any other questions that folks have? We'll hold one more minute here to see if folks want to type in more. And also, as you can see on your screen, you can, here's some follow-up questions now. You can also contact Jamie at the email address listed there, but we have a few more questions.
Can you click that one?
Yeah.
Okay. So the question is, have you considered developing an environmental cost, damage externality, so that perhaps a cost can be considered to be applied to the cost of fertilizers so as to internalize that external cost? I think that's a great idea, and we need an environmental economist to work with us on that project. I know that Long Island Sound recently did an economic analysis of the sound, and I can certainly envision that's a great next step for this model, but haven't gotten it funded yet. The next one is data on nitrogen from fertilizer seems to only implicate that which reached an aquifer. What about the contribution of fertilizer that runs off after a rainfall? Yep, this is one of those cases where I knew I wouldn't have enough time to go into the details, but some of that rainfall runoff is included in the model. It is incorporated into those attenuation factors, is some estimate of how much of that fertilizer will run off from your lawn onto your driveway, carry down to the storm drain. So that's all wrapped up into these kind of estimates of what we expect. Another question, does the FAR scenario have any sampling verification? So the FAR scenario, I believe, refers to the fact that in areas that are in what we call the FAR zone, so these are areas of the watershed that drain to a pond or wetland. In our model, we specify that it has to be greater than 1 acre in size before continuing on to an embayment, and that gets additional nitrogen removal. There has been fieldwork in other areas which get at how much of the groundwater that drains to a pond actually enters the pond and has nitrogen removed versus kind of ducking under the pond and going deeper in the ground and thus bypassing the pond. So some of that is included in that estimate of removal by ponds and wetlands. However, it is a hard thing to field verify. So we did not field verify it for this. We used kind of a literature review to get at those estimates. Again, it's going to vary greatly by watershed and the geology of the watersheds. but that is certainly something that could help. I, however, think that it has relatively, the model is relatively insensitive to that, meaning that it has relatively little impact on the load when we vary it within the ranges that we know are typical for removal from ponds and wetlands. So that was our last question in the list so far.
I think so. Unless someone types fast, I'm going to close it out there and take this time again to thank Jamie for this webinar. I thought it was fantastic. She took a very complex topic with a lot of different inputs and parameters and made it understandable even for somebody like me who doesn't have a background in this stuff. But anyway, I hope you all got a lot out of this webinar. And for those of you who have friends who are not able to listen in, as I mentioned in the beginning, we did record it. And so you can direct them to our website, clear.uconn.edu, to view a recording of the webinar. But thank you, everybody, for attending. And one last question that just came in.
Will this be available as a PowerPoint? I will be putting the PowerPoint up on my website. So it's in the recording, but if you go to my website, the PowerPoint will be available. I also have another PowerPoint up, which is very similar, but I'll be putting up this one as well.
Okay, great. All right, thanks, folks. Enjoy your day.